The night loomed like a walking fortress, a tower of steel upon a massive warhorse. Sunlight glanced off his polished armor, blinding in its brilliance, while his lance stretched forward like a spear of fate. To the peasants who watched from the sidelines, he was more than a man. He was legend, a weapon unto himself, said to be worth 10 ordinary soldiers. His charge was unstoppable, his presence enough to scatter the untrained. For centuries this myth reigned unchallenged, a truth hammered into the hearts of Europe's poor. To stand against such power was to invite death. And yet, hunger sharpens resolve, and desperation breeds innovation. In the mud of Europe's fields, peasants began to see not invincibility, but cracks in the armour. What followed was a clash so brutal, so unexpected, it shattered centuries of fear. The life of a medieval peasant was marked not by choice but by necessity. Dawn meant labour, dusk meant exhaustion, and the years between birth and death were measured in toil. The rooster's cry was no invitation to rise, but a command. Bare feet pressed into cold, wet soil as families trudged to the fields, their backs already aching from yesterday's harvest. They bent low over barley and wheat, hands cracked and raw, bellies often empty. The rhythm of survival was relentless, broken only by the sting of a lord's tax collector demanding his due. The weight of obligation was crushing. For every sheaf of grain gathered, a portion vanished into the manor's stores. For every pig fattened, a tithe claimed its flesh before the family could taste it. Even death offered no reprieve. Lords claimed inheritance taxes, stripping widows and children of what little security remained. Disease stalked the villages, famine hovered at the edges of every poor harvest, and starvation was never more than a winter away. It was a life designed to break spirits, and yet somehow, spirits endured. The gulf between lord and peasant was as wide as heaven and earth. Nobles dined on venison and sweet wine, feasting in candlelit halls while peasants gnawed on coarse bread that often carried more husks than flour. Knights, glittering in armour, regarded the commoners as tools to be used or bodies to be spent. Their disdain was no secret. Chroniclers of the age sometimes wrote of peasants as if they were little better than beasts, born only to till the soil and pay tribute. A noble could strike down a commoner with impunity, confident that law and church alike would shelter him. To resist was to invite not only punishment but annihilation, and yet the soil of Europe bore not only crops but resentment. In the bustling towns of Flanders, resentment deepened into fury. Flanders was no sleepy backwater, but a vital hub of Europe's textile trade. Its wool was gold, woven into the cloth that kings and merchants coveted. But prosperity was a double-edged blade. French kings saw wealth and hungered for it. Taxes rose higher, levies multiplied, and local freedoms were trampled under the heavy boot of distant rulers. Flemish peasants and artisans alike were squeezed until there was little left to take but their dignity. The sparks of resistance first flickered in market squares and taverns, where whispers of unfair burdens grew into mutters of rebellion. The French crown treated towns as pawns, favouring certain merchants, crushing others, and drawing blood with every coin demanded. What began as grumbling soon took shape as collective rage. Guild members, farmers, and craftsmen began to murmur of defiance. Their words carried on smoky tavern air, their oaths whispered beneath the shadow of cathedral spires. Into this tinderbox stepped a figure who would harness rage into discipline, Nicholas Zanakin. A prosperous farmer from Lampanese, he was not a knight, not a noble, not a man born to command, but he carried something more dangerous than a title. He carried the respect of his peers and the conviction that submission was no longer survivable. Zanakin listened to the anger of the people, but he did not let it spill into chaos. He understood that anger alone could not kill knights. Untrained mobs would be slaughtered in minutes by charging cavalry. What was needed was strategy, organisation, and the courage to defy centuries of fear. The people of Flanders found themselves standing on the edge of an impossible choice. Continue bowing under the crushing weight of lords and foreign kings, or rise and risk annihilation. It was a choice no one envied, yet hunger and humiliation had already stripped them of everything else. When survival itself demands rebellion, even the meekest hands will grasp a weapon. And so, in the mud of their fields and the crowded alleys of their towns, peasants began to prepare for war. But preparation meant more than sharpening tools and forging pikes. It meant shattering the illusion of knightly invincibility. The question was not whether the peasants were angry they were, The question was whether anger could be honed into a blade sharp enough to pierce steel. And that answer would come, not in words or whispers, but on the battlefield. Nicholas Zannekin was not born into banners and bloodlines. He was a farmer, a man whose hands had known the weight of ploughs and the sting of calloused labour. Yet when the fury of Flanders demanded a leader, it was to him that peasants and townsfolk turned. He embodied their cause, a man of the soil, neither distant noble nor foreign king, but one who suffered as they did. Zannekin's gift was not the sword, but vision. He understood what others dismissed, that peasants could not fight like knights, but they could fight differently, and in that difference lay their only chance. Discipline became his creed. Where mobs once surged chaotically, Zannekin imposed order. Villages and towns formed militias, bound by oaths as strong as iron. Weavers and butchers drilled in formation, moving as one body rather than a scatter of frightened individuals. Their pride grew with each exercise, for in those drills they glimpsed something new: peasants who no longer ran before a charge but stood firm. It was a transformation not of weapons alone, but of spirit. Weapons, however, were the marrow of their survival, and here ingenuity thrived. The most feared of their arms was the Gurdendag, a deceptively simple hybrid of staff and spear. A thick wooden shaft bristling with an iron spike, it could be wielded to smash a foe's skull or planted against the ground to skewer a charging horse. Farmers reforged scythes, axes, and flails into instruments of war, each tool carrying the memory of the fields where it once reaped harvests. Pikes, long as lances, bristled from the ranks, forming walls of steel that no horse could easily penetrate. This was not noble steel from Parisian forges, but peasant iron hammered in village workshops, rough and crude yet brutally effective. The militias did not only arm themselves, they learned to think like soldiers. Barricades were raised, ditches dug, and choke points chosen with precision. Zannekin and his captains understood the one truth knights despised. Cavalry thrived in open ground, but faltered in mud, marsh, and narrow ways. Thus, terrain became the peasant's first ally. Fields once tilled for harvest now became killing grounds. Streams and dikes turned into traps for hooves and armour. What knights saw as weakness peasants tied to their land was reshaped into strength, for no one knew the lay of the fields better than those who had worked them all their lives. With newfound discipline and sharpened arms, the militias struck boldly. They seized Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, the beating hearts of Flemish trade. These victories were not mere riots but coordinated assaults, cities captured through strategy and unity. For the first time, the nobility felt a tremor of fear. Peasants had risen before, but always as mobs crushed by cavalry in open fields. This time, the insurgents did not scatter. They marched, occupied, and governed. They fought not as rioters, but as an army. The victories electrified Flanders. Towns sent men willingly, guilds supplied arms, and villages fed the swelling militias. The people began to believe what once seemed unthinkable, that knights could be defied, that steel and horseflesh could bleed before the hands of weavers and shepherds. The legend of invincibility began to crack, not in whispers but in the clang of iron-shod boots on cobblestones as militias drilled in town squares. But triumph carried a shadow. For every town reclaimed, the French crown's wrath grew hotter. King Philip IV could not tolerate defiance in a province that fed his coffers. He summoned his lords, rallied his knights, and prepared to unleash the full fury of France upon the rebels. At their head rode Robert of Artois, a seasoned commander confident that one thunderous charge would scatter peasants as easily as chaff in the wind. The peasants knew what was coming. Scouts brought word of banners massing on the horizon, of armoured hosts glittering like storm clouds of steel. This was no tax collector to be driven off, no garrison to be ambushed. This was the hammer of France, and it was falling swiftly. Fear whispered in the dark, but Zannekin's voice cut sharper. He told them what they already knew in their bones. If they broke now, they would return to bondage or the grave. If they stood, they might yet carve freedom from the mud. So preparations began for a reckoning unlike any the world had seen. Pikes were planted, barricades raised, streams mapped with careful precision. Men who had once bent their backs to sow seed now braced themselves to reap knights. The air in Flanders grew heavy, charged with the knowledge that a storm was coming, and when it came, it would not be the peasants who trembled. The summer sun hung heavy over the fields near Kortrijk. Heat shimmered above the marshy ground, rising like a warning no knight cared to heed. On one side, the banners of France unfurled in dazzling display, thousands of knights in polished plate, horses armoured and restless, their plumes swaying like a tide of colour. Each man was the product of generations of training and privilege, wrapped in steel, confident that their charge would crush the rabble assembled before them. Chroniclers later estimated that nearly 2,000 mounted knights and their retinues filled the plain, supported by infantry and crossbowmen. It was the pride of France, summoned to remind peasants of their place. Across the marsh, the Flemish militia waited. There were no glittering banners, no warhorses stamping the ground. Instead, rows of butchers, weavers, and farmers stood in plain woolen tunics, pikes bristling like a living wall. The weapons in their hands bore the scars of the workshops from which they came. Iron spikes hammered onto ash shafts, flails repurposed from threshing floors, and the dreaded golden dags gripped tight in calloused fists. They lacked nobility's splendour, yet they carried something weightier. Desperation sharpened into discipline. The ground itself was their chosen ally. Streams cut across the plain, ditches crisscrossed the fields, and the earth was sodden from recent rains. Horses would sink, hooves would stumble, formations would falter. Zannekin's militias had studied this terrain, prepared it, and now stood like stones against the storm they knew was coming. The French commander, Robert of Artois, looked upon them with disdain. To him, they were nothing more than peasants who had forgotten their station. He ordered the cavalry forward. Trumpets blared, drums rolled, and then the earth itself seemed to shake as armoured horses thundered into motion. It was the sound of legend, the charge that had shattered countless foes, the irresistible tide of steel and flesh, but the ground betrayed them. As the cavalry pounded across the field, horses plunged into hidden ditches, stumbled in mud, and crashed into one another in chaos. Riders cursed, lances wavered, and formations broke apart before they even reached the Flemish line. Those who pressed on met the wall of pikes. Spears braced against the soil caught horses full in the chest, sending beasts rearing and riders tumbling into the mud. The clash was thunderous. Knights slammed into the militia with the force of falling towers, but the peasants did not scatter. Golden dags thrust upward, smashing into armour joints, spikes biting through mail. Pikes pinned men to the earth, and flails came down with sickening cracks against helmets. The roar of battle was deafening, horses screaming, steel grinding, men shouting in desperation and rage. For the knights, it was unthinkable. The charge, their most sacred weapon, had failed. They tried again, regrouping and launching fresh assaults, but each wave met the same fate. The marsh swallowed their speed, the ditches tore their ranks apart, and the Flemish wall held firm. Panic rippled through cavalry lines as knights realised they were not invincible here. The battle devolved into brutal melee. Knights, toppled from their horses, found themselves trapped in mud, their heavy armour turning into a prison. Flemish fighters swarmed them, levering visors open with daggers, hammering down with clubs and spikes. The air stank of churned soil, blood, and sweat. Cries for mercy were drowned in the cacophony, for the peasants knew mercy was rarely given to them. One by one, French banners fell. Robert of Artois himself was cut down, his pride buried beneath peasant iron. The glittering tide of nobility collapsed into a rout, men scrambling to escape the mire that had become their grave. By day's end, nearly 1,000 knights lay dead, their bodies strewn across the fields they had scorned. The aftermath was as shocking as the battle itself. Flemish fighters moved among the corpses, cutting golden spurs from the boots of the fallen. Nearly 500 were gathered, shimmering trophies of a victory no one had believed possible. The spurs, once symbols of knightly honour, now hung as proof that the myth had been broken. They would be displayed in the Church of Our Lady in Kortrijk, a silent reminder that even the mightiest could bleed. Word of the defeat spread like wildfire. Across Europe, nobles trembled at the news. Peasants had not merely risen in revolt, they had stood in open battle and destroyed the flower of French chivalry. The shock reverberated far beyond Flanders, seeding doubt in the very foundation of knightly supremacy. But for the victors, triumph carried a different weight. They had seen the impossible become reality. They had slain the armoured giants who had haunted them for generations, and as they stood among the fallen, bloodied but unbroken, they knew this was not the end, because others were watching. And they, too, would learn. The shock of Kortrijk rippled across Europe like a crack through ancient stone. For centuries, knights had been seen as the arbiters of war, the armoured fist of feudal order. Yet peasants in Flanders had torn that illusion apart. Their victory was not merely a local triumph, but a signal fire. Others watched, others learned, and soon the fields of Europe would tremble with new uprisings. The most formidable of these would rise a century later in the hills and valleys of Bohemia, where a man named Jan Žižka forged peasant defiance into an unstoppable force. Žižka was no knight, no noble commander, but a man hardened by scars and faith. Blind in one eye and later losing the other, he led not through fear of punishment but through iron discipline. His creed was simple: order must hold, or all is lost. Among the Hussites, disobedience meant death, for Žižka knew that only unity could withstand the charge of knights. What the Flemish had done with pikes and goad and dags, the Hussites refined with invention. They took wagons, the common carts that once carried grain and firewood, and transformed them into rolling fortresses. Chains lashed them together into squares, forming barricades bristling with spears, crossbows, and, most terrifying of all, the first crude firearms. Peasants armed with flails once meant for threshing wheat, now swung them with deadly precision, crushing helmets and snapping bones. From behind their wagon walls they poured bolts, stones, and gunpowder fire into cavalry that smashed uselessly against their defences. The sight was apocalyptic. Knights who once charged with unstoppable momentum now found themselves broken against walls of timber and iron. Horses reared and fell, riders sprawled into mud, and volleys of shot tore through ranks that had believed themselves untouchable. Again and again, Žižka's war wagons rolled onto fields where peasants faced noble armies, and again the nobles left broken in retreat. Europe had never seen peasants wield such devastating ingenuity. But the Hussites were more than battlefield tacticians. They were a movement. Fueled by religious zeal and the fury of centuries of exploitation, they did not merely fight for survival, but for transformation. Towns and villages under Žižka's banner became symbols of resistance, their wagon forts standing as proof that ordinary people could not only defy knights but rout them. The effect was chilling for Europe's nobility. Reports of nightly slaughter spread like wildfire, each tale adding fuel to the fear that the age of cavalry supremacy was ending. Not every peasant rising found such triumph. In England, the revolt of 1381 swept through London in a storm of fire and fury. Enraged by crushing taxes and unending wars, peasants marched on the capital, beheading officials and forcing the young King Richard II to parley. Their demands were radical freedom from serfdom, fair rents, justice without lordly abuse. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the old order might crumble, but cunning and treachery undid them. Leaders like Wat Tyler were slain, promises of reform dissolved, and the revolt collapsed beneath the mailed fist of authority. The rebellion was crushed, yet the memory of it lingered, a scar etched into the consciousness of rulers and ruled alike. The difference was stark. Where the English rebels burned bright and were extinguished, the Flemish and Hussites had built discipline and strategy into their cause. They understood that rage alone was not enough. Rage needed structure, formation, and tools that could turn fields into fortresses. The spark of Flanders had ignited a flame in Bohemia, and though England's revolt faltered, it too proved that peasants could no longer be dismissed as silent beasts of burden. Europe's nobility could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Once, knights had been the unquestioned masters of war. Now, rumours spread of peasants standing firm against charges, of wagon forts that defied lances, of pikemen who could drag armoured men from their horses and slaughter them in the mud. Whispers became certainty. The knight's supremacy was no longer eternal, and yet the greatest blow was not the loss of battles, but the loss of belief. For centuries, peasants had feared knights as untouchable. Now they had seen knights broken, humiliated, even slain by the hundreds. The myth of invincibility was dying, and once a myth dies, it can never be revived. But the final unravelling of knightly dominance would not come in taverns or whispers. It would come on the grand stage of Europe's battlefields, where professional armies and peasant levies alike would prove that horse and steel could not withstand the march of change. The spurs gathered at Kortrijk hung heavy in memory. But their weight was far more than gold. They symbolised a fracture in Europe's order, a shattering of the illusion that knights were untouchable. Once, the mounted warrior in steel had stood as the pinnacle of power, the embodiment of feudal dominance. But after Flanders, after Hussite wagons, after peasant pikes had toppled warhorses in the mud, the myth was gone, and with it, the age of knightly supremacy began to crumble. Economics made the collapse inevitable. A single knight was costly to maintain his horse bred and trained for war, his armor crafted by master smiths, his retinue supplied with food and weapons. By contrast, peasants armed with pikes or bows cost little. 100 men with sharpened steel could be trained faster and fielded cheaper than a handful of knights. Rulers and cities alike began to see the balance. Why pour fortunes into a few armoured nobles when masses of disciplined infantry could do what knights could not? The shift was clearest in England's long wars with France. At Crécy in 1346 and again at Agincourt in 1415, longbowmen shattered the chivalric ideal. Thousands of arrows darkened the skies, piercing armour, felling horses, and turning knightly charges into heaps of broken bodies. Mud, rain, and exhaustion humbled the proudest lords, their gilded armour dragging them down as surely as Flemish mud had done a century before. Where once knights had ridden as gods of war, now they fell like any man, their corpses stripped of glory on sodden fields. Professional armies rose in their place, mercenaries drilled in formations, pikemen stood shoulder to shoulder, crossbowmen and gunners carved new paths through steel and flesh. Gunpowder, first crude and unreliable, grew deadlier with each decade. Cannons battered castle walls that knights once defended with arrogance, reducing stone fortresses to rubble in thunder and smoke. The knight, once master of siege and field alike, became obsolete, his armour no match for powder and shot. Yet beyond weapons and armies, the deeper change was in the minds of the people. The peasants of Flanders, the rebels of England, the Hussites of Bohemia all had shown that nobles could bleed, that oppression could be defied, that unity could tear down centuries of fear. Golden spurs, once badges of honour, now hung as trophies of defeat, symbols of a new order rising from the mud. The fear that had bound generations began to loosen, and with it the unquestioned dominance of the feudal elite. Oppression had sown its own destruction. By demanding too much, by pushing too far, lords and kings had created enemies where there might have been subjects. Hunger and desperation had sharpened into rebellion, and rebellion into victory. What had begun as survival had reshaped history. The knight, who once seemed eternal, became a relic of a bygone age, and yet the lesson lingers beyond history. When power seems absolute, when the armoured few tower over the many, it is easy to believe resistance is futile. But the peasants of Flanders, the Hussites behind their wagons, the rebels who carried farm tools into battle, proved otherwise. They stood in the mud, faced the impossible, and won. The next time you hear of underdogs facing impossible odds, remember them. Remember the fields thick with pikes, the wagon forts bristling with fire, the golden spurs cut from fallen lords. Remember the peasants who refused to bow, who shattered fear with courage, and who changed the course of history not with wealth or nobility, but with unity and defiance.